areas today for Vestry Orientation. The first is a little bit about the history and the role of the vestry in Episcopal congregations. Um, the second is very similar to that, tied to that. It's what ECF we think are key areas of vestry responsibility. This certainly incorporates the canonical responsibilities that all vestries are required to fulfill. It also includes things like discernment and articulation of God, of mission and vision for the congregation. So a few other key responsibilities that the vestry carries on behalf of the wider community. Then we'll be going through tools and resources for new vestry leaders. Oftentimes this is one of the most helpful sections. Throughout all our surveys, people say that this is one of the most helpful sections of vestry orientation, so we're spending a little bit more time discussing the tools and resources available for folks. And then lastly, we're going to talk about potential next steps, ways in which we can take some of this information and take some immediate next steps that will hopefully strengthen our vestries and through that all our congregations. So just a bit of history about the vestry. You may be wondering why there is an armoire on this slide. It has to do with the history of the vestry, especially in the Church of England. The Church of England, the annual election of church wardens took place during Easter week, and it was a very simple process. All adult male parishioners would crowd into the room where the clergy would robe, a room called the vestry, to hear the accounts of past church wardens and elect their successors. Later in Episcopal Church history in Virginia, parishes had become so large that it was impossible to crowd all the voting members into one robing room, and so they developed the practice of electing 12 representatives for life. So let me repeat that. The original terms for vestry members was for life. So we are all grateful for many changes in the evolution of the vestry, and I think that's probably one of them. Thankfully, also, we've expanded our understanding of who can have voice and vote. Obviously, it's not just adult male members anymore. Vestries are made up of women and men. And one thing that many people do not realize is that depending on your diocesan canons, vestries can also include youth and young adults. With certain provisions, youth can be elected to serve on vestries. So one thing that we would encourage you to do is check with your diocese and learn if there have been provisions that have been created so to allow youth to serve on vestries. It's really one of the I think it's one of the most interesting ways in which youth can enter fully into the decision-making process and leadership process for your community of faith. For the average vestry today, usually vestries are elected at the annual parish meeting, which often takes place just about now at the beginning of the calendar year. There is a range of sizes of vestries. It's fairly common for vestries to range between 6 to 12 members, depending on the size of the parish. One practice among, especially among very small or smaller Episcopal congregations, is to trim the size of the vestry to about 6 people, so as to eliminate some bureaucracy. As you might imagine, if your average Sunday attendance is around 35 people, a 12-member vestry is incredibly hard to maintain. So one immediate step to simply helping with the functioning of the congregation is to look at the size of your vestry. Another thing that many vestries do, I shouldn't say many, but is practiced within the Episcopal Church, and again, this is especially the case among very small rural areas, is kind of return to the original practice of vestries and become an all-church vestry. And again, this really requires looking into your diocesan canons and checking with your diocese to see if provisions have been made about this. But in some vestries, the entire church will gather to make significant decisions periodically throughout the year, and it's the entire church that's operating as the vestry. So the rector, or rather the clergy of the parish, is the presiding officer of the vestry, which is not to say that they necessarily need to lead all vestry meetings. The former bishop of the Diocese of Texas advises his clergy to consider, this is Claude Payne, to consider training a lay member, perhaps a senior warden or junior warden, or someone on the vestry with particular gifts in meeting facilitation, to facilitate the regular meetings of the vestry. Bishop Payne's point is that this really allows clergy to focus on the matter at hand rather than on the running of the meeting, to note body language in the room, and to intervene when necessary. So to spend a lot more time listening rather than worrying about how the next agenda item and et cetera. So if we encourage you to just consider that. There are usually 2 wardens on a vestry. The senior warden leads the parish between rectors and is supposed to be a source of support for the rector. The junior warden oftentimes has special responsibility over church property and buildings. Some vestries will elect a treasurer and clerk, and these may or may not be vestry members. One of the things that I want to just underscore is that there is a wide variety, clearly, of practices and sizes among the vestries, and that's going to also be a theme that we come back to over and over again. Some folks think that certain things are set in stone, and in fact, the practice vestries practices range pretty widely across the Episcopal Church. But what is it that vestries do at their core? We think that there are 4 basic things that vestries do. And the first is that they listen deeply. They gather together to discern where God is calling the congregation in their location and at this particular point in time. Secondly, they help to articulate the mission and vision of the congregation. And we're going to talk about what those words mean, the mission and vision, because they're very, very important in leading a community of faith. Thirdly, vestries identify new leaders for the congregation and wider church. And oftentimes this is only thought of with respect to the nomination and election process. But in fact, we encourage you to really think about it much more broadly. Vestries, because it's comprised of both lay and clergy, have a special role in identifying potential new leaders for the congregation and helping to do some discernment of gifts with those leaders and helping them find places where they can flourish in their faith. And then lastly, vestries are stewards of the resources of the congregation. Oftentimes this is the primary thing that is understood as vestry's role, and it is absolutely important. We just also want to add discernment to that responsibility.
So what do the canons say about the role of the vestry? A quick note first, though, for those who aren't familiar with it. Canons are basically church laws. Canons are church-wide, which are set by General Convention, which meets once every 3 years. You can think of that in terms of what we have in civic law in terms of like federal laws. Then there are diocesan canons, which is more your localized level. You can think of that sort of the equivalent of your state or county laws. And then there's also a further level, which is at the parish level, which are your bylaws, which hopefully your parish has your bylaws set up and available to peek at if necessary. But the canons that are set are things that everybody has to abide by. And surprisingly, there actually are very few canons on what that stipulate what the role of the vestry are. But the four canonical functions that you're supposed to, or vestries are to carry out, broadly speaking, the first two relate to making sure that the congregation is being good stewards to their property and finances, being agents and legal representatives in all matters concerning the corporate properties, and to the clergy as well. And to also ensure that standard business practices are observed, which is also legally important when you consider liability, which we will touch on later as well. And then the second two, somewhat interestingly, relate to identifying religious leadership. Vestries play a particularly important role during times of clergy transition and in nominating people for holy orders. So those things to bear in mind. But the role of today's vestry, when you consider the where we are in 2014, what we're looking at right now, the average Sunday attendance across the church is actually 65 people. There's a total of just over 1,700 congregations. 68% of our congregations have an average Sunday attendance of less than 100, and it's only 5% of Episcopal congregations that have an average Sunday attendance of, I believe it's 300 or more. So when we're coming together vestries and you're encountering some of those situations that you're trying to grapple with in your congregation in particular, just kind of bear in mind sort of the wider scope and picture in terms of where you are. A lot of people think that 65 is quote unquote small, and actually, quite honestly, that's where you're right in the middle. That's the median attendance that's out there. And some of the things that we at ECF has identified as important for the role of today's vestry that we would just like to highlight for you is to look at that we are no longer in a primarily Christian society. This is an increasingly pluralistic society that has a wide range of faith options that's reflected in people's choices of faith, that people are increasingly comfortable with changing their faith, and including with having none, and the rise of the quote-unquote nuns, where roughly a quarter of younger Americans don't belong to any particular religion. That within ASA of 65, there's also roughly a third of congregations have a part-time or non-stipendiary priest. This is an increasing number, so that this is actually a pretty healthy, sizable amount of Episcopal congregations that do not have even one full-time clergy person in charge of the congregation. And that, in turn, we have a reliance in lay people to be able to carry out the functions of the congregation. Increasingly, with our pluralistic society, we're looking at changes of race as well. The Latinos are the fastest growing demographic in the Episcopal Church. We are seeing this differences in terms of generational patterns when it comes to giving. I encourage you to check out some of our financial resources. Erin Weber Johnson has a great blog post on ECF vital practices where she breaks down really nicely sort of the different characteristics that have been very well studied that especially Generation X and millennials have very different giving patterns compared to baby boomers and other generations as well. And I would just encourage you when looking and considering some of these things to look in your pews, see what's there, who's out there, what's out there, and then beyond your walls, what's really surrounding in your community? What does that look like in contrast or comparison to the folks that are in your congregation and who you're reaching to? And to take a sense of where your congregation is in terms of our present-day realities. Furthermore, I would just like to offer up some of what we have. ECF Auto Practices puts out a survey once every other month to 150 random users from ECF Auto Practices. To date, we've had over 800 responses to the survey, which has been a wealth of information that we've been able to go through to collect and find out what's going on in Episcopal congregations. And through that, we've identified some of the top challenges that Episcopal congregations are facing these days. And as you can see on there, looking at change and dealing with change and how that impacts in areas of communications. We all know with social media, is it print versus digital, the capacity to be able to utilize new tools, being able to figure out how to reach new people through these tools as well. Stewardship issues, of course, again, in looking at differences in giving patterns, and a lot of people feeling like they're stuck in that what they're doing isn't working. Vestry leadership, of course, with changes in the ability to fund one or multiple clergy for a congregation, and how that is shifting the roles of both clergy and lay people within a congregation. And last but certainly not least, in vision and planning, on being able to identify where you're being called to, and being able to plan effectively for the future.
One, Brendan touched on this, and it has to do with this piece about vision and planning. One of the things that many congregations, Episcopal congregations are struggling with is to become really clear about why they are an Episcopal congregation in their particular community, and what they offer that is unique to their neighborhood. So one of the first and most important tasks of the vestry is spending time discerning these questions around why, discerning God's mission and vision for the congregation. This means changing the nature, or we suggest that this means over time changing the nature of one's vestry meetings to focus increasingly on prayer and Bible study at the very beginning, spending significant amount of time, we're talking about 20 to 30 minutes of a vestry meeting doing some Bible study, conversation about big picture strategic issues, really gathering together to listen to where the Holy Spirit is leading the community. In some Episcopal congregations, and I think this is especially in more medium-sized to larger-sized Episcopal congregations, their vestries will restructure themselves. They will create an operational committee to handle the issues around finances and property, to which they hear reports and give consent or not, or advice. But this allows them to spend a little bit more. This allows them to spend a little bit more time doing strategic work and visioning, as opposed to getting into the weeds of the business sessions. So that's one way in which some medium-sized to larger congregations restructure themselves. Now, obviously, that's not always going to be possible, and given that the majority of Episcopal congregations are smaller, people will have to do, that's not necessarily immediately applicable. So one of the most important ways that congregations discern where God is calling the community is that they spend a little bit of time, or they spend a significant amount of time, articulating a mission and vision for the congregation, and they do so on an ongoing basis. Um, we have in the Episcopal Church one shared mission. It's in the Book of Common Prayer, but as many folks note, it's about finding out how to live out that mission in our particular place and in this particular time. ECF takes a page from the leadership expert Peter Drucker to note that mission is a simple, operational description of what it is that you do. What is it that you do as a congregation? Because we're an Episcopal church, we'd like to note that it's not just what we do, but it's also what God is calling us to do. Vision is a word that is used in a wide variety of ways. Again, drawing on the organizational development piece, we understand vision to be what the church and world looks like once our mission has been fully realized. It's a hopeful picture of what the church and world looks like once our mission has been fully realized. I think one point that I just want to underscore is the importance of vision in leading change and in galvanizing a community around change. Even more than a shared mission statement, a vision statement and a shared sense of vision is a tool for pointing people in a different direction. It's one of the most important components of leading people in change. So if your congregation already has a mission and vision statement, one question that I have is just for you to consider, how is your vision being shared? Is the vision of the congregation being preached regularly? Is it incorporated into the newsletter? If you look at the homepage of your website, if you have a website, does it describe where the congregation is, what kind of world the congregation is hoping to build? That is really quite core to being a vital community of faith. Another key vestry responsibility, of course, is about being good stewards of property and resources. We mentioned earlier the canonical responsibilities associated with this. Vestry shall be agents and legal representatives of the parish in all matters concerning its corporate properties, and they shall ensure that standard business methods will be observed. One of the ways in which these fiduciary responsibilities are carried out is, well, there's a variety of ways. One of the most familiar is through the running of an annual stewardship campaign, and these monies go to the annual budget. Many are pointing out that gone are the days when a once-a-year annual stewardship campaign fully funds an annual operating budget. This is for a variety of reasons, not many in our control, but one of the results of this, or one of the end results of this, is that vestries, many vestries have to consider how they can diversify their income sources to supplement or to build a strong annual operating budget. So that's one of the first, I think, one of the most important things that vestries need to consider. And examples of this might include space rental, they might include events, they also might include running a small business as well. But all of those things can help build a thriving annual budget. Vestries need to be aware of issues like building maintenance and expansion and debt, and consider periodic capital campaigns to address those issues. Vestry should, if you have an endowment or if you're interested in creating an endowment, setting up endowment policies, sound endowment policies, developing a planned giving campaign or program are ways in which vestries attend to the financial health of the congregation. We mentioned liability a little bit earlier, that vestries are legal representatives for the congregation. That holds a particular weight and accountability. And so that's one thing that vestries, especially new members, need to be aware of. It's like serving on the board of any
And just a little note further from there, and particularly coming from my background is in a congregation. I was the director of administration. That one of my cohorts is used to say her mantra was liability, liability, liability. But without driving yourself crazy, to bear some things in mind. For example, during the winter, I used to be in Chicago. Things can get really icy during the winter there, and I remember going one particularly icy winter and asking that we get, spend more on getting more salt for the sidewalks around the church grounds, and the vestry members came back and said, well, why do we need more? It shouldn't be everybody walking around the church grounds during the middle of the week. Which was slightly incorrect because we did have a school on the church premises, even though they weren't parading around the church grounds, but there were definitely people who were passing around. But even if that wasn't the case, if somebody trips and slips and falls on our church property, regardless of whatever insurance you have, people can sue for that thing. And ultimately, it is the vestry's responsibility, and people can come after the church for stuff like that. And it's just to bear in mind that yeah, you need to be maintaining those things. If you are renting out your space to another group, do they have the proper insurance coverage if something happens? If there's musicians and their equipment are in your building, do they have coverage for that? Have you worked out the responsibilities if anything happens during an event that occurs like that, etc.? So sometimes it's just taking the extra step to really think about some of the extras that are there, again, without going overboard with driving yourself crazy with those things. But moving on and looking at, again, with vestry responsibilities and realizing some of the things that we want to highlight for you, we talked about identifying new leadership and its importance. There's the canonical responsibilities that we touched on, and Miguel has also pointed to broadly that more broadly we really encourage vestry members to be thinking about identifying and recruiting new leaders, both lay and clergy, for any number of roles in your congregation, but to also be looking at bringing out particular individual gifts. The new leaders can inspire an amazing breadth of things within a congregation. In terms of your nomination and election process, which is probably on the tip of many people's minds right now, coming towards the end of January, to consider the types of folks that you're looking for. On ECF Auto Practices, we have just an article that was just published this month that I would encourage you to check out and consider, that talks about that doing away with the election process, and instead the congregation does a selection process, and by drawing names out of a hat, and has found that really works well for this congregation instead, and they have more people in putting their names in the hat, literally, to be considered for the vestry by this process. They made a change to their bylaws to be able to do this. They checked out their diocesan canons. It was permissible. They do this to consider some flexibility with the process. Many places have found that an extended discernment period really is necessary and works well to be able to find and cultivate good leaders for vestry service. Janie Morris has published some great piece and a tool as well to help guide you through a couple-month process that's not arduous, but just makes a very intentional effort at being able to find and recruit new leaders for your vestry. So check out resources. Know that there are other options out there for you to be selecting new vestry members. And Miguel has just put up that one about selecting vestry members. Thanks, Miguel, for that.
If I could also just add, I think just to be completely clear, um, with the example of selecting vestry members out of a hat, what makes that allowable, or what makes that possible, is that there's an intense focus first on the nomination process. So there's an extensive nomination process by which people kind of really weigh and discern whether or not they want to be part of the vestry, and the vestry considers their gifts and talents, and so then they end up with a wider number than slots, and that's the number that they're selected from. So it's a little less willy-nilly than...
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for clarifying if I did not intend to imply that. So thank you, Miguel, for clarifying that for me. And finally, we'd like to highlight some bits that congregations can learn from community organizing. In being proactive about identifying new leaders, one of the commonly used steps is to use the format of one-on-ones. And so to be able to have a one-on-one with as many people as possible, you're building up your docket of potential new leaders. And in these one-on-ones, it's literally just a simple coffee and an ask is the sort of basic breakdown of that. And you're using the rule, sort of the 80-20 rule, where they should be talking about 80% of the time, you only about 20%, really taking time to learn about folks. You would be surprised where we can learn new things and new passions about people that you may not be aware of. One of my colleagues here at ECF, I like to point out, has a heavy background in finance. And her congregation immediately boxed her into, oh, we'll put you on the budgeting committee and help with the endowment and this and this and that. And her real passion was really for, and which people weren't necessarily aware of, that she had a master's in social work, had a real passion for prison ministry and very, very soulful spiritual stuff that if nobody bothers to scratch the surface on there, wouldn't have been able to find out, and to be able to use some wonderful, wonderful gifts. So highly encourage you to consider that. We have some great resources and other webinars on identifying recruiting new leaders on ECF Auto Practices if you want to check more about that. And finally, leave you with a nice little mantra that's in community organizing, that if you want something done, to ask a busy person. Frequently, we tend to be like, oh, we'll find the person who's retired or the person who's a stay-at-home mom. And again, these assumptions can be really misleading. Not that the stay-at-home mom or the retired person couldn't be a potentially great leader, but to consider your options, get to know people, and not be afraid of asking somebody who's really busy, because obviously they're in demand and could be a potentially great person. It's not to say that they won't say no the first time, that may not be able to do that right away, but this could be somebody that will be able to be a very great asset for you down the road. And then meeting effectively, meetings, is a huge part, of course, of what the vestry does. Hopefully you're meeting regularly and retreating regularly. There's a regular pattern to your meetings that are laid out so that you're meeting once a month, however much is necessary and for a defined amount of time. The orientation, I would be a great opportunity to go over guidelines, basics of the roles and expectations. Vestries, we recommend to have norms and or a covenant. Again, there are some great resources you can look up for that. Just Google Episcopal Church, Episcopal Vestry Covenant, and up pops some great examples of places that have example covenants that they post publicly to show the expectations for their vestry members. So that people have an understanding of what they're supposed to do. I've run into more than one occasion where people feel frustrated because people some people aren't stepping up, or people aren't attending meetings. And when you kind of scratch the surface, though, it's like, well, if you asked people, identified that you're expected to show up to all your meetings, and we expect you to show up on time. We expect this out of people, and to know what they're supposed to be doing is a really seemingly basic but very important step to take, and to have that laid out. Retreats are a great opportunity to do these orientations as well. One of our bloggers is a great expression to retreat, to take one step forward, is an opportunity for everybody to get to know each other, and as to begin functioning also as a spiritual group together in leadership.
To note the time.
Oh, yes, we're running a little short. So quite a bit we've also covered on with other bits and bobs on here, but would also just point out again with agendas that these things aren't set in stone. There are some great examples that are out there that you can consider for other options for structuring your vestry meetings. Take a look out there. There are some wonderful resources, and please contact us if you have other questions about meetings as well. So without further ado, questions or comments?
Yes. One of the because of the time, I want to invite folks to, if you have questions or comments, type them into the chat box, and we're gonna, I think, continue directly into the next section, which is on resources, because this is oftentimes what a lot of people find the most helpful, and I just want to make sure everyone gets this. Brendan, I think because we also have a question, if we could do this, I guess in the next 6 or 7 minutes, that'd be great.
We'll breeze through this, but with still touch on some of this important stuff. So we covered a lot of material here, but we definitely encourage you to consider when you're looking to elect your new vestry members and doing a vestry retreat, to get your toolbox together. If you're new on the vestry, ask for and start to look for some of the resources that you need, including the canons, incorporation laws there, and your bylaws, sort of those great sort of basics for it. One quick note, though, as well, to not forget also the Bible in there, and to be keeping things prayerful in all of your meetings as well. Some particular resources we want to highlight include the Vestry Resource Guide, sort of your one-stop shop for all things vestry, which is available through Forward Movement and also at Episcopal bookstores and other booksellers as well. This has some sample vestry covenants and other examples for you. Also some great Bible studies that are incorporated into the content in there for your vestry to be able to reflect on. ECF model practices, which we have mentioned multiple times, and I encourage you to all check out, and if you don't already, to subscribe to ECF model practices to get vestry papers and our mid-month digest in your inbox each month. Features some great stories, examples, tools, resources from congregations all throughout our church, and one of the great things that we're able to do is to find those wonderful examples that are working in congregations and to be able to highlight those for you to be able to help equip you for your ministry.
Great. The other, these final two are very important as well. They are, the first one is the Manual for Church Business Methods, and this is a very important guide that's available for free download at the following link, and it offers a lot of information which will help your vestry and congregation fulfill its fiduciary and reporting roles within the Episcopal Church. The second tool is the Episcopal Church Office of Research, which provides a link that gives basic stats about your parish as well as a community profile. And again, this is entirely available for free. and it just provides invaluable information, especially about your neighborhood. And if you're looking to, especially as many congregations are looking to become, again, neighborhood congregations. So thank you, Brendan, very much for kind of shifting a little bit on the time. What we'd like to do is just uh, conclude with some next steps. Um, I'm not going to read these out loud because everyone can read, but what I hope is that they inspire some questions and conversation, and that's going to be the focus for us for the next uh, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up. So these are some steps, and I have another slide of potential next steps.
And Elizabeth was wondering if we have any suggestions or tools for doing visioning.
We do, and I think that that one of the most important ones is coming up actually, Elizabeth, and that is there's a upcoming webinar on February 4th at 7 p.m. About vision and planning. And we have done this webinar once before. Unfortunately, the recording of it was broken, so I would love to provide the link to that. But from the conversation, it was one of the most important webinars that we've done. So if you're not able to make it, just be in touch and we'll send you the recording afterwards. I'm very hopeful that will work, and it really provides, I think, a very clear, cohesive description of what we mean by visioning, or what is meant by visioning. Other questions? Great. The Power of Vision by George Barna. Wonderful. We also have an issue of Vestry Papers about vision and planning. We also have a tool on strategic visioning. Planning for your church. I'm going to just put these links in there. Fred, it really it does depend on does depend on the diocese, and each diocese, some dioceses will create provisions in their canons so that people who are below are not 18 will or it's provisions and guidance, so they will know when to abstain from votes, when not to, and the entire vestry will make sure that that person is doing so. So it really depends diocese to diocese, but that is exactly the concern that most chancellors have. And so there's the diocese has to provide guidance on how to do that.
And my suggestion, Fred, would be to reach out to some other dioceses that do have youth on vestry. I know my former diocese, the Diocese of Chicago, does permit this. See if you can fish up the examples of the resolutions that were passed. Ask anybody if they know any history or background of the issues that were faced with that, and see if you can just get some more information to be able to show that this has been done, and maybe find out what were the sticking points for other folks. There's some great youth ministers that are out there. Forma is the organization for Christian formation folks. Could be a great resource to turn to for folks that are involved with youth ministries that I'm sure are advocates for being able to get youth on ministers. And of course, we also have that tool. I was trying to remember where that was located on the site. Thanks for posting that as well.
Yeah, it's not really a tool. It's Bronwyn Clark Scove, who helps coordinate youth ministries in the Episcopal Church, just wrote a piece based on the resolution that came out of General Convention about kind of encouraging dioceses essentially to make these provisions and consider how to allow youth to be on vestry. So Fred noted that they allow youth with voice no vote to avoid legal questions. So that's another great way of, or a better way of doing that. Yeah. Right. Exactly, Dennis. Yeah. Here's another another page of potential next steps. Uh, um, one one suggestion is watch ECF's webinar, The Basics of Parish Finances. Let me, Brendan, can you actually get the link?
Sure, I'll go get that.
That webinar is led by Jerry Kuchar, who is about as close as I think the Episcopal Church comes to as an expert in parish finances. And it's a very excellent overview, I think, of how to think through questions regarding parish finances. So I recommend that to everyone.
And we have one coming up if you wish to participate in the actual webinar itself and to be able to bring your questions to the table. That one's coming up on February 5th.
Other questions?
How are new people feeling, the newly elected folks? Are you thinking, yeah, I got this? Anything that you're not quite sure about still? Or seasoned veterans are looking towards doing your vestry orientations? Are there things that you're still looking for being able to equip your new vestry members? A couple people typing.
Great.
Awesome. Well, glad that no questions at this point. But again, be happy to answer your questions if you have them in future. We'll be pulling up our contact info before we wrap up. So delighted to hear that.
I guess the one point that I would make is if you don't have a vestry covenant currently, or if you want to look at other examples of vestry covenants, one of the things that you can do is literally type into Google vestry covenants, Episcopal churches, and you'll see multiple examples of vestries. I think they're, and you'll see how vestries essentially frame roles and expectations. And again, this is a great thing to do, as Brendan noted, a great thing to do during vestry retreats.
Charles has a very interesting question about sharing a minister in congregation and shared budget. Anyone else doing this? We certainly heard of and know of other congregations that are sharing their buildings and also partnering with other congregations and Lutheran congregations in particular. It's throughout the country. I know we've had even had an article talking about congregation moving in with the Lutheran congregation. So increasingly we see congregations taking advantage of the call to common ministry. So that definitely is out there, and we definitely have folks that are doing this within in many different settings. Shared budget, I think is actually the case with that, but that's an interesting thing. I definitely I'm not as familiar with that, but would be curious to see what's out there. Awesome.
Well, I guess one question that, this is Miguel, and now my webcam's gone. One question that I would have is, do you only share a budget, or do you also share the leadership, essentially, team, vestry, as well as, is it a joint vestry parish council. I think that would be very unique if you weren't sharing the leadership team but sharing the budget. But be interested in following up with you on that. We are coming to the end, so Brendan, if you could say
again, please contact us if you have any other questions, or if you find yourself a month away, 3 months down the road or something, and you kind of hit that point and you're like, ooh, not so sure about that, please be in touch with us. Visit the Episcopal Church Foundation website for everything on our leadership and financial resources. Go to ECF Model Practices, where you can subscribe for free for Vestry papers and other great resources as well. Email and phone up there as well. And also, please feel free to be in touch with any of us on ECF Leadership Resources team directly. My colleague Miguel, the program director, Nancy Davidge, who is not with us this evening, but our associate program director and editor of ECF Model Practices, and of course myself, Brendan Hunter, the assistant program director. Just want to also note to everybody before you sign off that you will have gotten in your inbox, we'll be getting shortly a link to a survey for about this evening's webinar. We also have the link in the lower right-hand corner of your screen under the helpful links box. Please, we really encourage you to just take a moment to fill out this survey. We highly value your feedback and use this to be able to cultivate our webinars and our articles and our resources, and particularly for this webinar as well, we will take your feedback in to be able to tweak this and improve our presentations. Let us know what really worked, what may have not worked, but we really take this to heart and really value your feedback to be able to improve our presentations for you. But again, we thank you so much for